everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be tackling something that affects, every single one of us.
Oh, yeah.
Your privacy.
It's a big one.
And how the government handles information about you. So to get into all of that, we've got some fascinating source material to unpack today.
Absolutely.
We're going to be looking at excerpts from the U.S. Code,
Okay.
Title V, specifically sections 552A and a little bit of 552B.
Okay.
And alongside all of that, a memo from President Obama about the Freedom of Information Act.
FOIA.
You probably know it better as FOIA.
Right.
So these are like the laws that determine how the government can collect and use and share your information.
Yeah, and it can be kind of a lot to digest.
It can. So we don't want to get lost in all the legalese.
No, we're going to keep it practical.
Exactly. We're here to give you practical knowledge you can actually use.
That's the goal.
So think of this as your crash course in Privacy Act 101.
Privacy Act 101.
I like it.
All right, so we'll start by kind of building our foundation here.
With the Privacy Act of 1974,
Okay.
imagine it as your personal data fortress against government overreach.
Okay, a fortress. I like that.
Yeah. So it all begins with some key definitions, and that's where it gets interesting.
Okay, let's hear it.
The definition of record is surprisingly broad.
Okay, so it's not just like, your social security number or something.
No, it's way more than that.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Think about things like financial transactions, medical history, employment history, even photographs and fingerprints.
So it's any piece of information that a government agency keeps about you.
Yeah, and that can be used to identify you.
Oh, wow. So it's pretty broad.
It is.
Right.
So basically anything that could link back to me is considered a record.
That's right.
Okay, but how do they organize all this information?
That's where the system of records comes in.
Okay.
Think of it like a giant filing cabinet.
Yeah.
But the government stores all the information it has about you. So it could be any government database that can retrieve your information using like your name, a specific number, even a photo.
Okay, so it's not just random bits of information floating around. It's all organized.
It's all organized.
Into these systems.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so now this might sound a bit concerning.
Right.
Does this mean the government can just access and share all this information about me whenever they want?
No, not at all.
Okay.
The Privacy Act sets very clear limits on how these records can be used and disclosed.
Okay, good.
Like, for example, Section 552E lays out very specific and limited circumstances where the government can disclose your records without your consent.
Okay, so it's not a free-for-all.
Right.
They can't just hand over my info to anyone who asks for it.
Exactly.
Okay, can you give me some examples of those limited circumstances?
Sure. So, for example, they might disclose records for legitimate law enforcement purposes.
Okay.
Or if it's required by another law.
Okay, that makes sense.
But remember, in most cases, you have control over your information.
This is where I feel like a lot of people get nervous.
Yeah.
Feeling like they're losing control of their personal data.
I get that.
It's reassuring to know that there are safeguards in place.
Yeah.
But how can I be sure that they're actually following the rules?
You can check.
Is there any way to check?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
That's where Section 552AC comes in.
Okay.
This section mandates that government agencies keep a detailed accounting of every time they disclose your records.
Okay.
You have the right to request this accounting.
Wow.
And find out exactly who has accessed your data.
So it's like a paper trail for my personal information.
That's a great way to put it.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there are exceptions to this rule, right?
There are a few, primarily for disclosures related to law enforcement.
Oh, okay.
As outlined in Section B7.
Okay.
But overall, the Privacy Act is built on this principle of transparency.
Transparency is key.
It is.
Okay, but let's shift gears for a moment.
All right.
And talk about President Obama's FOIA memo. Okay. This memo seems to double down on that whole transparency idea, doesn't it?
It does.
Like it's really emphasizing that.
Yeah, what's really crucial about this memo is that it establishes a presumption of disclosure.
Okay.
This means that if there's ever any doubt about whether information should be released, the default is to err on the side of openness.
So it's not about keeping things secret unless there's a really good reason. It's about being open unless there's a reason to keep it secret.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does that benefit me, though?
Well, this presumption of disclosure makes it much easier for you to get information from the government through FOIA requests.
Oh, okay.
You have a much better chance of accessing information that might have been kept secret in the past.
Okay, so it shifts the power dynamic a bit.
It does.
It's not just about protecting my information, but it's also about making it easier to get information from the government.
That's right.
It sounds like Obama's memo was a pretty big deal.
It was a significant step towards a more transparent government.
Oh.
The idea is that the government shouldn't be able to hide information just to protect its own image or interests.
Okay.
Like they say, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, back to the Privacy Act.
Okay.
What happens if I find out that the government has something wrong in my file?
Hmm.
Like, what if they've got my birthday wrong or my address or something like that?
Well, that's where Section 552 AD comes in.
Okay.
This section gives you the power to access your records and request corrections if you find any inaccuracies.
Okay.
You have the right to demand accuracy when it comes to the information the government holds about you.
So it's not like I'm stuck with whatever they decide to put in my file.
Yep.
I have some recourse.
You do.
So how does this work in practice?
It's actually a fairly straightforward process.
Okay.
You submit a formal request to the agency. They have a specific time frame to respond.
Mm-hmm.
And if they refuse to amend the record, you even have the right to appeal their decision.
So there's a whole system in place to make sure things are done correctly.
There-
But what happens if I request a correction and the agency says, nope, we're not changing it?
That's when things get interesting.
Okay.
If an agency refuses to correct your record, you have the option to file a statement of disagreement.
Okay.
And this statement must be included anytime your record is disclosed in the future.
So it's like having my side of the story permanently attached to the record.
Exactly.
The government can't just ignore my perspective, even if they disagree with it.
That's right.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense.
Good.
Now let's flip the script and look at it from the government's perspective.
Okay.
What kind of responsibilities do agencies have when it comes to handling my data?
That's where Section 552 AE really gets into the nuts and bolts of data security and responsible data handling.
Okay.
It outlines a whole set of responsibilities for government agencies to make sure your information is protected.
Can you give me some specifics? Like, what kind of rules do they have to follow?
Well, for starters, agencies can only collect information that is relevant and necessary to fulfill their specific duties.
Okay.
They can't just go on a fishing expedition for data about you.
So it's not just a free-for-all
No, it's not.
where they can collect whatever they want.
It has to be directly related to their work.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And when they collect information, they're obligated to collect it directly from you whenever possible.
Right.
This is especially true if that information is going to be used for any decisions that could impact your rights or benefits.
That's right.
So like if they're deciding whether to approve me for a loan or something,
Yeah.
they can't just pull my information from some random database?
Exactly. They have to get it from you directly.
Okay.
It's about giving you more control over how your personal information is collected and used.
I like that.
Yeah.
What else does the Privacy Act require agencies to do?
Well, they're required to inform you about WHY. They're collecting your information, how it's going to be used, and what the consequences are if you choose not to provide it.
Okay, so no more collecting data in the dark.
Right. Transparency, transparency,
It
transparency.
seems to be the recurring theme here.
It is a big one.
All right, and finally, they're legally required to establish safeguards to protect the security and confidentiality of your data.
Yes, that's important.
What kind of safeguards are we talking about here?
Well, it includes technical measures like encryption,
Okay.
but also administrative controls like limiting access to only authorized personnel.
Okay.
So it's about protecting your data from unauthorized access, use, or disclosure.
So the Privacy Act sets some very clear boundaries and responsibilities.
It does.
Which is great.
Yeah.
But what happens if a government agency decides to ignore these rules? What are the consequences for them?
That's where things get serious.
Okay.
Section 552 AII outlines the criminal penalties for any government employees who violate the Privacy Act.
Okay, so we're not talking about a slap on the wrist here.
No, we're not.
There are actual consequences for agencies that don't play by the rules.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay.
We're talking about fines, potential imprisonment,
Wow.
and even criminal charges for willful disclosures of protected information, maintaining systems of records without proper notice, or for individuals who try to access records under false pretenses.
Whoa. Okay, so those are some serious repercussions.
They are.
That's reassuring to know.
Yeah, these penalties are in place to underscore the importance of protecting your information and highlight the fact that privacy violations are not taken lightly.
Okay.
The Privacy Act has teeth.
That's good to know, but I have to ask, are there ever any exceptions to these rules?
There are a few.
Okay, because it seems like there are always exceptions to everything.
Right.
I'm curious about these exceptions.
Okay.
When would the government be allowed to bypass these privacy protections?
So, for instance, Systems maintained by the CIA
Oh, okay.
or those used for law enforcement purposes might have certain exemptions.
Okay.
However, it's important to remember that the government has to justify these exemptions
Oh.
and explain their reasoning. It's not a blanket free pass.
So there has to be a really good reason for them to bypass these rules.
Right.
And they have to be transparent about why they're doing it.
Exactly.
It seems like there's always this balancing act between protecting national security and individual privacy.
It is a delicate balance.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second
Right.
and connect all of this to the bigger picture of open data and government transparency.
That's a big picture.
All right.
So we live in an age where data is incredibly valuable and increasingly accessible.
It is.
The Privacy Act and FOIA are both part of a larger conversation about how we can make government data public while simultaneously protecting the privacy of individuals.
That sounds like a tricky equation to balance.
It's a constant challenge.
Yeah, because more transparency often means less privacy and vice versa.
It's tough.
And to make it even more complex, we also have Section 552B,
Okay.
the Open Meetings Act,
Right.
which is yet another example of transparency efforts.
It is.
I've heard of the Open Meetings Act, but I'm not really sure what it's all about.
Okay. Well, the Open Meetings Act mandates that most government meetings be open to the public.
Okay.
This promotes accountability and allows citizens to participate in the democratic process.
So I can actually go and watch these meetings?
You can?
See how the sausage is made, so to speak?
Exactly. You can observe, listen, and even record the proceedings.
That's pretty cool.
It's about bringing government operations out into the open.
I like the idea of having that level of access,
Yeah.
but I'm guessing there are some exceptions to this rule, right?
Of course, meetings that involve sensitive national security information
Right.
or ongoing legal matters are typically closed to the public.
Of course.
But in most cases, the presumption is in favor of openness.
Okay.
Agencies have to have a good reason to shut the public out.
That makes sense. There have to be limits, especially when it comes to sensitive information.
Right. It's all about finding the right balance between the public's right to know and those other legitimate interests.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
From the Privacy Act to FOIA to the Open Meetings Act, it's been a whirlwind of information.
It has.
But I already feel like I have a much better understanding of how all of this works.
That's great to hear.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on a specific scenario.
Sure.
Let's say I'm applying for a government job.
Okay.
How do all of these principles we've been talking about play out in that situation?
That's a great example. Applying for a government job is a perfect illustration of how the Privacy Act directly impacts you.
Okay.
We'll delve into that scenario in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm hooked. I can't wait to hear more about that. We'll be back soon to continue our exploration of government records and your rights.
Sound good?
Stay tuned.
See you then.
Welcome back. I'm really excited to pick up where we left off and dive into that real-world scenario you mentioned, applying for a government job.
It's a great example.
It seems like the perfect example of how all these privacy laws we've been talking about actually play out in everyday life.
It is. Think about it.
Yeah.
When you apply for a government job, you're handing over a ton of personal information.
You are.
You know, your social security number,
Right.
employment history, maybe even financial information for a background check.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where things can get a bit unnerving.
Yeah.
It's not like applying for a job at the local coffee shop.
Right.
You're dealing with the federal government here.
Exactly. And that's where the Privacy Act steps in to protect you.
Okay.
Remember Section 552AE3.
Oh, yeah.
That section requires the agency to be completely upfront about why they're collecting your information.
So they can't just demand my social security number without explaining why they need it
Nope.
and what they're going to do with it.
Exactly. They also need to tell you whether providing that information is mandatory or voluntary.
Okay, that makes sense.
So
So if they say it's required, they better have a darn good reason.
they absolutely should. And they also need to inform you about the potential consequences of not providing the information.
Okay.
For example, they might state that failure to provide your social security number could result in your application being rejected.
That's a pretty big consequence.
It is.
So the Privacy Act is basically ensuring that I'm making an informed decision about sharing my data.
Right.
I understand the implications before I hand over that sensitive information.
Precisely. It's about transparency and informed consent.
I like it.
Now, let's say you get the job.
All right.
Congratulations.
Whoa.
But imagine you later discover that there's an error in your personnel file.
Oh, that's my nightmare.
Yeah, like what if they got your birth date wrong?
Yeah, or it listed an incorrect previous employer.
Yeah, things happen.
Things happen.
And that's where Section 552A comes back into play.
Okay.
Remember, it gives you the right to request access to your records and ask for corrections.
Right.
In this case, you would contact the agency's Human Resources Department and request to review your personnel file. If you find an error, you can then request that they amend the record.
So the Privacy Act isn't just about preventing the government from misusing my data.
Right.
It's also about empowering me to correct mistakes and ensure that the information they hold about me is accurate.
Absolutely. Accuracy is crucial, especially when that information is being used for important decisions about things like promotions, security clearances, or even disciplinary actions.
And remember, if the agency refuses to amend the record, you have the right to file that statement of disagreement,
Yes.
which will be included with any future disclosures of your file.
You got it.
You're not powerless in this situation.
That's a key takeaway here.
Yeah.
The Privacy Act gives you a voice and a way to ensure that your perspective is taken into account.
Yeah.
It's about balancing the government's need for information with your fundamental right to privacy.
Okay, all of this talk about the Privacy Act is really interesting, but let's switch gears for a bit
Okay.
and talk about FOIA.
All right, FOIA.
How does that fit into this whole picture?
So FOIA is all about government transparency. It gives you the right to request access to government records, even if those records don't directly pertain to you personally.
So I could use FOIA to request, say, records about a government project.
Yep.
Or the minutes from a public meeting.
You got it. FOIA is a powerful tool for journalists, researchers, and anyone who wants to hold the government accountable.
And remember, President Obama's memo.
Oh, yeah.
It emphasized a presumption of disclosure.
Right.
Which means agencies should generally err on the side of releasing information rather than keeping it secret.
Exactly. Less secrecy, more accountability.
Right. That whole sunlight is the best disinfectant idea.
Exactly. Now, there are exemptions to FOIA, of course.
Oh, okay.
Some information like classified national security data is rightfully kept confidential.
Of course, we don't want to compromise national security in the name of transparency.
No, we don't. But the key is that those exemptions are supposed to be narrowly construed.
Okay.
The government can't just hide information because it's embarrassing or politically inconvenient. There has to be a legitimate reason for withholding it.
So FOIA is kind of like a check and balance on government power.
It is.
It allows us to scrutinize their actions and make sure they're serving the public interest.
That's right. And it's important to note that FOIA can be used in conjunction with the Privacy Act.
Oh, okay. How so?
For example, you could use FOIA to request records about how a particular agency is implementing the Privacy Act.
Oh, okay.
Are they following the rules? Are they properly safeguarding your information?
Yeah.
FOIA can help answer those questions.
So it's like a 1-2 punch for transparency and accountability.
Just like that.
The Privacy Act sets the rules for protecting my data, and FOIA gives me the means to ensure the government is playing by those rules.
Exactly.
I like it. Now, can you give me a real-world example of how FOIA has been used to reveal important information about government activities?
Absolutely. Remember the Edward Snowden leaks a few years back?
Oh, yeah, that was a huge story.
It was those leaks revealed the extent of government surveillance programs and sparked a national debate about privacy and security.
Yeah, it really brought to light just how much data the government was collecting.
It did.
And how little oversight there was.
Well, after those leaks, journalists and advocacy groups used FOIA to request records about those very surveillance programs.
Oh, wow.
Those requests led to the release of documents that shed light on the legal justifications for the programs, the volume of data being collected, and the safeguards or lack thereof that were in place to protect people's privacy.
So even though the initial revelations came from a leak, FOIA was essential in pushing for greater transparency and holding the government accountable for its actions.
Exactly. FOIA is often used to follow up on stories like that, to dig deeper and demand more information from the government.
Okay.
It's a vital tool for investigative journalism and public oversight.
This all sounds pretty powerful, but I'm guessing it's not always easy to use FOIA effectively.
It can be tricky.
What are some of the challenges people face when making FOIA requests?
One of the biggest challenges is navigating the bureaucracy.
I bet.
Agencies can be slow to respond to requests, and they often try to redact or withhold information, claiming exemptions.
So it's not as simple as submitting a request and getting everything you asked for?
Unfortunately, no. It often requires persistence, some legal knowledge, and sometimes even litigation to get the information you're seeking.
Oh,
However, there are organizations out there that specialize in helping people with FOIA requests,
okay, that's good to know.
and there are also resources available online to guide you through the process.
Okay, so it sounds like mastering FOIA is a skill in itself.
It can be, but it's a valuable skill to have, especially if you're passionate about transparency and holding the government accountable.
Right.
It's one way to exercise your rights as a citizen and ensure that the government is serving the public interest.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive, from real-world examples to FOIA challenges. And it's been fascinating. Before we wrap up this segment and move on to our final thoughts, are there any last insights you'd like to share with our listeners about FOIA and the Privacy Act?
I think the most important takeaway is that these laws exist for a reason.
Okay.
They're designed to protect your rights and empower you to engage with the government in a meaningful way. Don't be afraid to use them.
Yeah.
Whether you're requesting access to your own records or seeking information about government activities, these laws give you a voice and a way to hold those in power accountable.
I love that knowledge is power, and now our listeners have the knowledge to take action and protect their privacy.
Exactly.
And on that note, we'll be back in the final part of our deep dive to wrap up our exploration of government records and your rights. See you soon. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into government records and your privacy.
It's been quite a journey exploring the ins and outs of the Privacy Act and FOIA.
We've definitely unearthed a treasure trove of information, but I feel like there's always more to discover, when it comes to this topic.
Oh, for sure. For sure. It's constantly evolving, especially in our digital age.
Yeah.
What was considered private 50 years ago might be considered public knowledge today.
That's so true. I mean, think about all the data we share online now. Social media posts, location data, browsing history. It's a whole new world of privacy concerns.
Yeah, and that brings up a really important question.
What's that?
How do these older laws, like the Privacy Act, apply to the digital realm?
Right, because the lines aren't always so clear.
They're not.
The Privacy Act was written way before the internet became what it is today.
Right.
So how do we reconcile these older laws with the realities of modern technology?
That's the challenge that lawmakers and courts are wrestling with right now.
Yeah.
Like, for example, how does the Privacy Act apply to government agencies using facial recognition technology or collecting data from social media?
Right.
These are questions that are still being fiercely debated.
It's like we need a Privacy Act 2.0, something that specifically addresses the unique challenges of the digital age.
There have been calls for updates, and there are ongoing efforts to modernize privacy laws.
Okay.
It's definitely an area to keep a close eye on.
All right, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier.
Okay.
The Open Meetings Act.
Right.
How does that work in practice?
So the Open Meetings Act ensures that most government meetings are open to the public. This means you can attend, observe, and even record the proceedings.
It's like having a window into how decisions are made.
It is.
You can see who's at the table, what they're discussing, how they're voting.
Transparency in action.
I like it.
Now, there are some exceptions, like meetings involving sensitive national security information or ongoing legal matters.
Right. I can understand why there'd be times when secrecy is necessary to protect sensitive information or the integrity of an investigation.
Exactly. But the presumption is always in favor of openness.
Okay.
Agencies have to justify why a meeting should be closed to the public. It's about balancing the public's right to know with those other legitimate interests.
Okay, so let's say I'm interested in attending a public meeting.
Yeah.
How do I find out when and where those meetings are happening?
Agencies are required to post notices of their meetings in advance, usually on their website or in a public location.
So a little online sleuthing can go a long way.
It definitely can. And many agencies even live stream their meetings these days.
Oh, wow.
So you can watch from the comfort of your own home.
That's amazing. In some ways, technology can actually enhance transparency.
It certainly can. But as we discussed earlier, technology also introduces new privacy challenges.
Right.
It's a double-edged sword.
Okay, before we wrap things up completely, I'd love to give our listeners some practical tips for protecting their privacy in this digital age.
Sounds good.
What are some things they can do right now to safeguard their data?
Well, the first and most important step is to be mindful of what information you share online.
Okay.
Think twice before posting personal details on social media or filling out forms that request sensitive information.
Right, not every website or app needs your social security number or your mother's maiden name.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Also, take some time to review your privacy settings on social media platforms and other online accounts.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure you understand what information you're sharing and who you're sharing it with.
It's amazing how many people just click accept without even reading the fine print.
I know it's worth taking a few minutes to understand those settings. Another crucial tip is to be extremely cautious about phishing scams.
Oh, yeah.
Don't click on suspicious links or open attachments from unknown senders.
Those phishing scams are getting so sneaky
They are.
and more sophisticated all the time.
They are, so staying vigilant is key.
Yeah.
And of course, be sure to use strong, unique passwords for all your accounts and enable two-factor authentication whenever possible.
Okay.
It's an extra layer of security that can make a world of difference.
And let's not forget about the good old-fashioned shredder.
Oh, yes.
Don't just toss sensitive documents in the trash. Shred them first.
Good point.
I might.
It's a simple step, but it can help prevent identity theft.
Well, we've given our listeners a lot to think about,
We have.
and hopefully a lot of practical advice they can implement right away.
I hope so.
To wrap up this whole deep dive, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure diving deep into this topic with you.
Likewise.
We hope this episode has empowered you with knowledge and given you some actionable tips for safeguarding your privacy in a world that's increasingly hungry for data.
That's what we're here for. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay vigilant.
And we'll catch you next time for another fascinating deep dive. Until then, keep exploring.